Welcome to Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where we bring evidence, experience, and perspective to make sense of today's leading health challenges. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
This is Lindsay Smith-Rogers, and today, a movie review. The Pixar movie Inside Out 2 recently became the highest-grossing animated film of all time. The sequel brings us back into the mind of Riley, who's now entering puberty and facing new emotions like anxiety and envy. Stephanie Desmond talks to Johns Hopkins psychologist Laura Murray about what the movie gets right about this period of emotional development and how it normalizes the kind of internal conflict we all feel sometimes. Just a note that you don't have to have seen the film to enjoy this conversation, and there are no spoilers. Let's listen.
Laura Murray, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me again, Stephanie.
So today I want us to play movie critic, all right? So you're a psychologist, and we both just seen Inside Out 2, which, by the way, is the highest grossing animated film in history after just like less than 2 months out. So clearly a lot of people have seen it. So I wanted to get your take on what we see in this movie. And I'll just give a little summary, which is, when we last left Riley, she was younger and she was ruled by emotions like joy and sadness and anger. And it was a simple life. And she was feeling really good about herself. And we come into this movie where she's about to go to high school, and we get introduced to a whole new set of characters, including anxiety. So I'm wondering, we see anxiety. She appears and she wants to take over. Really, what she wants to do is help. And so I'm curious how you feel about whether this was a good depiction of anxiety and where it comes into our lives.
Yeah. Gosh, I really love the movie. Anxiety as a depiction. So I think the movie did a couple things well as I think about it from a psychological lens. One, I loved the puberty button. What's going on? It's going off. Stop the button. Because I do think that that's kind of what happens. These kids' bodies go into hyperdrive. There's a ton of changes. I do think it can be very alarming. So I really liked how that gave us that sense of emotion and panic sort of in the film. When I think about anxiety and how they utilized that in the film, one of the things that comes to mind is when Joy clarifies that all emotions are really important. And that really stuck with me as a take-home message that I would love to share with more youth and parents too, that, lots of times all of us stuff down emotions where we feel like we shouldn't be angry or we shouldn't be envious or we shouldn't, have anxiety. And yet they're all really important. I think they also added envy and embarrassment was such a good character. And I do think that the way that they brought anxiety as something that was so much stronger than some of the other emotions, I felt like hit on what's going on in our society today, right? Like that is one of the most common emotions we're hearing about youth when we talk about this youth mental health crisis, about just the high anxiety and stress that they tend to be reporting. So I was very curious if the film did that on purpose, if they're sort of feeding into what we're seeing with our youth, but really liked all of them playing together.
So anxiety in this film is like, she's not really a villain. And I would have thought they might portray her as a villain. So talk to me about that.
Yeah. And for me, I think that comes back to anxiety is such a critical emotion and feeling for all of us, and something for us to really pay attention to, and something that we can utilize to be better, to be more competitive, to all sorts of different things. And I think when you're young, it's really important to feel that and know how to manage it, right? So there was that hockey scene too, where her anxiety really went into high drive. It almost looked like they were depicting a panic attack of sorts. I agree with you, though. I actually do think that anxiety definitely was so prominent in the film and came out so strong. And I do think that's what a lot of people talk about. Some of the other emotions are deeper or harder for youth to actually identify. Like it's very rare for youth to come into a psychologist and say, I'm envious and that's a problem. Whereas like it's very easy to say I'm anxious or I'm stressed or something like that. So I think they managed it very well that way too.
A lot of this also to me was sort of like a development of the sense of self. And that seemed to be like a major part of what happens at this time of life when the puberty button gets pushed. There was joy. Her mantra was, I'm a good person. And anxieties was, I'm not good enough. And they depicted how these two emotions compete with each other. And I'm curious, is this when we develop our sense of self? Is this what happens when all these emotions take the stage?
Oh, that's a great question. Gosh, sense of self is a topic that has been widely debated. Some people still believe, you kind of are who you are when you're born, right? You sort of have that self and you sort of come into it. Other people definitely believe that it's determined much more by environment and circumstances and things like that. So we do know, though, that developmentally, when you go through adolescence and puberty, that is so much of that rocky road, the up and down, lots of hormones, lots of changes. And so I think your sense of self tends to come out more because it's almost like what's surviving, right? What's surviving that tumultuous period and what's really coming out stronger. So again, as you're saying, Stephanie, right? Like what ended up coming out stronger? Was it, I'm a good person, or was it, I'm not good enough? And you felt that battle. I think one of the coolest things about this movie for me, and this is something that we've talked about before in some of our podcasts, is that I hope this movie normalizes some of this. Like this is very normal to be this chaotic at times and bells and whistles and not knowing what's going on and going between these cognitions that are causing these different emotions. That is, by definition, puberty, development, everything that happens in youth. And so I really walked away from this movie also thinking, gosh, I hope this normalizes for people that not everyone has a mental health problem. And just because you have anxiety, the goal is not to get rid of it or not to have it, or to think, oh my gosh, if I have anxiety, I need to see a psychologist and there's something wrong with me. I hope this movie sent the message to a lot of people that hey, this is normal. This is the time in your life where you're going to be juggling a lot of those different things and trying to come up with who you are and how do you manage all of these different emotions and how do those cognitions play into that. So yeah, I really hope that some people walked away thinking everyone goes through this and this is really normal.
So how do you feel like the film talks about managing the anxiety, and is it the right way?
Yeah. Well, Stephanie, I feel like there were touches on how to manage it. One of the things I wish the movie would have done a little bit more is pull in coaches or parents or, other types of people that can help youth manage this a little bit more. You did see her do some of, deep breathing or, physical touch when she was having something that sort of looked like a panic attack in the hockey match. I would say the biggest intervention that I saw was the cognitive intervention, meaning lots of times what we do as humans is we control our emotions by our thoughts, right? So them saying, I'm a good person, or it's going to be okay, or this isn't the worst thing, or that's really what can help us as human beings manage some of those emotions. And you saw a lot of that in the movie, both from the emotion characters and the talking overlay, just reframing negative thoughts to really help her get control of her emotions. So that I would say is the biggest intervention that I saw through the movie.
I think to me, one of the things that sort of really rang true was that there's room for all of these emotions. We all work together to create who we are and how we behave and how we think. And I know that's sort of how we talk to kids these days. We talk a lot about emotional intelligence, and we talk about people giving space to feel all types of emotions. And I'm wondering your take on that.
Yeah. Well, and I loved how the movie really took these emotional characters and had them helping each other in the end, right? And working together and managing their own relationships to sort of come together, right? Joy and anxiety in the end, connected up again. And I thought that was a really nice depiction of what essentially you want to grow into, what emotional intelligence is. It's using all of your emotions to manage each other and help with each other and know when one can step in and another needs to step back and things like that. And again, I do think one of the take homes of this is exactly what Joy said, is that it's really important to have all of these emotions and to not stuff them down. I think the other thing we often do, even as adults, which sometimes we teach kids by example, is to stuff things, right? And to not make space for those emotions, not communicate them, not be honest about them is one of the worst things we can do. I love that they brought in more emotions as she got older. I think that was genius. And just watching how they got along and kicked each other out and stuff like that, almost felt as a psychologist like, yeah, this is pretty normal. This is what goes on with a lot of us.
So I've been reading a little bit about what others have said about the movie, and I've read commentary from moms saying this was actually more descriptive of their lives than of their teens.
Yeah.
I'm wondering how you feel about that. It's an interesting way to look at it.
It is. It is. I have to say, as a mom myself to a preteen and a teen, it was helpful. It was almost therapeutic. It was like, gosh, the day-to-day stuff that you go through as a parent, especially as folks are developing, as youth are developing and going through puberty, can be like a roller coaster for parents. And I know you're a parent too, Stephanie. It's harder to watch your kids go through this, right? Like you're like, I know I went through this, but it didn't feel maybe the same as trying to watch your kid try to figure all this out and then know how to help them. And each kid is so different. So I've heard the same thing. Lots of parents saying this was almost therapeutic for me. I feel like I have a way now to talk to my kids about this, or we have a reference that's kind of funny, right? Like, oh, the anger person is coming back. I know we joke in our family, like which character is prominent in which kid. I mean, and it's my kids that are like, oh, wait, it's anger for me, or it's this for me. So I think that has really given families some room for discussion.
Well, that was going to be my last question. Is this sort of a good thing for parents and kids to watch together and then talk about?
Okay, so Stephanie, I'm going to answer honestly here. As a psychologist, I would say yes. Now, because I have teens and preteens, here's what my kids and a lot of their friends say. If we think that kids see this movie and think any deeper than like, hey, that was a good movie, we're kind of fooling ourselves. And, I was like, gosh, did I say this on the podcast? But I do think it's really important for us to say, like, as a psychologist, I can dissect this. And I came away with very different takeaways when I put my professional hat on. And I think that's why parents are saying this is so helpful for them, because we look at it in a different way. But we do have to be aware that I think for some kids, for example, one of the comments I heard from a teen is like, do I really have these people in my head? These are the kind of thoughts they have, like, or it was a good movie, or embarrassment was really funny, or you know what I mean? Like they maybe aren't digging in the same way. So yes, good to talk about, but also maybe not something to push, to recognize that maybe it's a reference you just make when things come up, rather than like, hey, let's have a serious discussion about this movie.
This was a great conversation. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks, Stephanie.
Public Health on Call is a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith-Rogers, Stephanie Desmond, and Grace Fernandez-Cesiri. Audio production by J.B. Arbogast, Holly Cardinale, Spencer Greer, Matthew Martin, and Philip Porter, with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Production management by Catherine Ricardo. Social media run by Grace Fernandez-Cesiri. Analytics by Eliza Rosen. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send us an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. Thank you for listening.